This is Felipe, Lake Fepard, Danaluz. My respect for this guy is off the charts, and that's where his game should be. He's the creator of the Spark the Electric Jester series.
I was introduced to Spark from Tisnaker's video on the games, and wishlisted them immediately. It took me a couple years to finally play them, but they were great. Probably don't watch his video until or unless you play them too, though. I find it pretty unfortunate that I went in spoiled. There are minor gameplay spoilers in this video, but this isn't an analysis, despite some being present anyway. It's an attempt to encourage people to play these games. If you need to be sold on that, this should be a reasonably safe watch. Still, I encourage you to leave and commit to playing them as early as you feel comfortable doing so, assuming that you do at all. If you do play Spark 1 without seeing any of the Spark 2 section, you should probably come back since those games differ tremendously. Spark the Electric Jester, a 2D action platformer, is my least favorite of the three. It's still a good time, mind. As shown earlier with the controls menu, it's made in ClickTeam Fusion. Pausing is very prone to crashing the game, particularly when it's being captured by a program like OBS or RivaTuner Statistics Server. I assume this is due to it creating a second window, but I'm not sure. Additionally, the game suffers inexplicable frame rate issues, at least on some systems, although as far as I can tell it doesn't have frame skip, so this is not a performance issue. While it won't fix pausing, the Spark Recharged mod does help tremendously with frame rate through its VSync option. If you play Spark 1, I highly recommend using the mod, just don't use the save it provides, that's a fully completed one. Anyway, enough technical stuff. I'd argue Spark is more action than platformer. Enemies are numerous, and Spark's Jester powers give him plenty of movesets to tinker with. Combat is about understanding these movesets to some degree, and they're quite varied for what they are. Spark has an energy bar which is filled through combat, although some powers eschew it, and energy has different applications depending on the active power. The pause menu does a relatively clunky job of communicating their capabilities, but it's adequate for how simple each one is. The platforming itself can be mixed. Some parts are engaging, some are dull and repetitive. It trends more towards the former overall, I'd say. Little use is made of the physics inherited from its Sonic fan game roots, so don't expect much of that, but Spark's focus on speedy flow is likely stronger than those games. Weaving between high-speed platforming and combat is a tenet of level design, and it benefits the former to skip over the latter when possible. I don't see it as a flaw, but some might. It makes for a nice rhythm and keeps tension up. It's fairly slick. The one issue I have with the controls is that there's a brief period during Spark's turnaround animation where the player is unable to jump. If you're anything like me, this will rear its head irritatingly often, although it's ultimately not that big a deal. Stages in Spark 1 are individually sprawling and lengthy, and any given casual playthrough will be multiple hours long. While I find it fatiguing, someone who enjoys the game more and has greater stamina may see that as a blessing. Exploration feels relatively rewarding since powers exist in set locations, and the size of levels never felt intimidating. It's very easy to be guided along by the terrain, so despite the massive sizes, they largely remain digestible and approachable. These stages are also the most effortlessly vibrant of the series, exuding a confidence and competence in constructing worlds that's not quite present in other entries. I'm not even that big on the soundtrack myself, but alongside the visuals it does wonders in conveying tone and narrative about these places. It all comes together very well. The plot is aloof and probably the least important of the three to get a grasp on. As long as you have a basic understanding of what characters are trying to do, you'll be equipped to generally understand what's happening. Even still, Spark 1 is presented with lopsided emphasis that makes it a little difficult to follow. It could be worth making a point to reiterate or recite plot beats to yourself in order to better solidify them, such that they don't get lost during gameplay and unrelated skits. A good example is that for me, the few lines at the end of the introduction where Spark decides to try stopping robots from suddenly attacking people just completely vanished as I played. I did not remember that detail at all until a second playthrough. If you don't really care about the story, feel free to just ignore this advice. Both sequels have more meat to their narratives, 2 has more plot, 3 has more substance, but it's not actually that important to understand this first game much to follow along with those. So yeah, Spark 1 is a cool action platformer with a good sense of flow and nice combat. It also has rather vivid locales, thanks in large part to its stylistically varied music and the clear confidence the developer has in creating 2D worlds. Fun time! Spark the Electric Jester 2 is vastly different from 1 in a few ways. First, it's a 3D platformer rather than a 2D one. Second, platforming, now partially physics-reliant, is its main focus. Third, it has a more understated and moody narrative presentation, while also placing more significance on its story. This doesn't mean the story is tremendously more serious, mind. It's still somewhat aloof, albeit nowhere near as much as the first game. I find it interesting for what it is and charming, though it has apparent faults. If you care about story, I'd say this game serves that interest more than 1 does. Spark 2 isn't a very long game, and I'm going to talk momentarily about its emphasis on replayability, but this game is engaging on a first playthrough. You don't need to speedrun it or play for score to enjoy it. It presents neat platforming and set pieces regardless. And it's important to say, all of Spark 2's platforming levels are included in Spark 3 as post-game stuff, with some functionality changed or removed. I'd personally recommend going through the series in order, but if you truly don't care about Spark 2's story or bosses, and you're okay with the different controls and physics altering the experience, you may be better served by just playing 3. But yes, the game has a fairly heavy focus on mastery through its medal system, which Spark 3 inherits to a lesser extent. There are 2 tiers of medals for 2 categories. One is speed, of course, and this is where the platforming really shines. Speed can be height and vice versa. Well-utilized down dashes can help go a little faster, or under certain circumstances, rocket fark forward. Routing isn't always linear, which can create puzzles out of deducing an efficient enough path to clear the medal requirement. Said requirements tend to be moderately strict, so it often takes a decent bit of effort to figure stages out. If grinding out sub-5-minute ILs seems enjoyable, especially if you want to tinker with routes and strats yourself, the medals may be up your alley. Score medals likely would be too. There's a soft time limit of 5 minutes on every level, where going beyond that rapidly drains the player's score. I'd recommend doing speed medals first and then score medals. Familiarize yourself with the general layout of a stage and quick ways to traverse it with the former, and then fill your route in with brisk hotspots of points for the latter. It can be difficult to figure out, but it's rewarding. And since I'm immensely unlikely to get many views, feel free to ask for some tips if you'd like them. I'll probably answer, I don't get a lot of comments. A decent number of bosses are scattered throughout Spark 2, and while all of them have speed medals, none have score. Combat isn't very deep, and, at least in my experience, encounters end up rather samey and thoughtless. I think it works fine, but it definitely isn't a selling point for most. The parry isn't only relevant to combat though, and its utility elsewhere is pretty cool, so that's worth knowing. In short, Spark 2 is a smaller 3D platformer about the thrill of moving at very high speeds. That fares well on its own, but flourishes if the player goes for medals. The skill ceiling is relatively high, and slope jumps are fun no matter your skill. The story is more prominent and takes a more grounded tone, though it maintains silliness and self-awareness even if it's more subtle. It's a great game. Spark the Electric Jester 3 takes after much of 2. It is substantially longer though, owing to its more considered reuse of assets. There are fewer main stages than in 2, which only had main ones, but for the most part they each have associated side stages which build on concepts that the main ones introduce, or explore tangential ones. Each level gives a freedom medal upon completion, and areas are gated behind these. I know this isn't an analysis or critique, but I have to say it. These stages destroyed the pacing for my first playthrough. Though they're generally enjoyable levels, it always felt like after every main stage I had to go do my chores for 20 plus minutes to get back to what I was doing. I think this is largely due to them being framed as side content, and frankly there's no good fix I can come up with for it. Still a hindrance for me. I definitely made it worse by choosing to do every side stage as they came up. If you intend to do them all too, you should probably actually save some for the postgame. That said, it's very possible, perhaps even likely, that you won't have problems with the pacing. After all, the issue isn't that they're poor experiences, they're great. The game keeps an impressively high bar for quality. And as I alluded to, that quality is paired with variety. Spark 3 layers several mechanics on top of its Spark 2 core, such as rail grinding with substantial and relatively consequential interactivity. Some of these are stage gimmicks, some are universal stage elements, and some are alterations or additions to Spark's core moveset versus Fark's. For that last type, most of the new abilities are part of the shop, a returning mechanic from Spark 2 which now sells actual abilities rather than being a convenience hub for Jester powers. There are purchasable combat abilities as well. And combat has been overhauled. It's fundamentally a lot more involved, with juggling and some relatively simple combos. The parry works differently, and enemy attack patterns matter a lot more in switching up the rhythm of any given fight. Encounters can still end up samey once you're accustomed to the system, but unlike Spark 2, your approach is actually affected by the enemy or enemies you're up against. The player works around attacks instead of ignoring them, and makes decisions. While if you're not into it, this more demanding style may put you off of the game, I find it's an adequately deep and kinetic system to be enjoyable. In fact, being exposed to it a lot, which is not required, I found it holds up surprisingly well. Medals aren't the same as in Spark 2. Speed medals work as you'd expect, but the greater scale and complexity of 3's levels can make routing a lot more daunting. This is counterbalanced by time requirements generally being lax for the main stages, probably due to their length. For all but a few levels, it wasn't actually necessary to route the whole thing, I merely played competently on an improvised path. Being less demanding makes them less interesting to me, although it could be the inverse for you. The greater length of stages also affects score medals though, no more time limit. This means that, with the exception of one side stage, score is about tediously grabbing and destroying everything until you cross an arbitrary threshold and can leave the level. This could simply mean that they fulfill a different role, encouraging the player to slow down a bit and appreciate the environments for what they are. However, that ends up being redundant, as there's a new type of medal that accomplishes the same thing: Explore medals. In theory, they could serve as a way to incorporate neat challenges into stages as little side objectives. In practice, their placement ends up feeling uninteresting. Both medal types entail slow, thorough wandering in vast spaces. It's not for me, though I'm sure some like it. Tonally, the story is sort of a half step back to Spark 1, kind of. And there's probably a bit less plot than 2. As I said though, I think it has more substance. It's hard to say much about it because I don't want to spoil anything, just it's fairly interesting and can be a little high concept. Spark 3 is a more polished and skillful game built on top of the foundation of Spark 2, incorporating more mechanical variety and reworking combat tremendously to be more involved and engaging. It loses some of the features and nuance the prior game had due to differing priorities and, especially, a much larger scope for many of its levels. Though it contains most of Spark 2, it isn't a replacement for it. That game stands on its own, even if for many it likely stands far shorter. Personally, I like them both a lot. I don't think I can rank them per se. As I said at the start though, Spark 1 is my least favorite of the 3. Still a good time, mind. Finally, if anyone does end up playing these games due to this video, let me know what you think of them. Could be detailed, could be Spark 1 was cool but 2 and 3 sucked, I don't know. Whatever you feel up to writing, if anything.